So what we have planned out for you this morning is some of the, I say something old, something new. We're not going for something borrowed and something blue, but we have some of our classic favorites at the museum. And over the course of the last 5 years, there have been a number of changes to the museum. We've been bringing some of the stories that we have here, updating things and actually creating an entirely new gallery and drastically updating one of our older galleries and doing some updates on a few other ones. So what I'm thinking about doing, what we'll be doing together for the next little while is, like I say, some of the old favorites. If anybody has been to the museum, has everybody there been to the museum?
Well,
at some point?
I've muted most of everybody just so we wouldn't have a lot of background noise.
So I'm thinking that the museum has been open for a bit more than 50 years now. So some of you folks might have come here a long time ago. Maybe you've come here with kids or with grandkids in the last little while. So you might have, all right. So I am here at the entrance to our Nonsuch gallery. This is one of everybody's favorites. It opened up 74. And if you haven't been here in a few years, this map might be new. This is the map that when the original Nonsuch, what we have here in the museum galleries is a replica, is a copy of the Nonsuch. But when the original Nonsuch sailed back in 1668, this is the map that they likely would have been using. And if you have a look at the map, there's a fair bit that does look familiar. Iceland, for example. We go down to Scotland.
This is the museum. Manitoba Museum.
Yeah. So the ship went from Deptford. You can see going past Iceland. You can see Greenland. And what I love about this map is that there's some areas that are uncharted territory. So you can see where they've been able to map out along the coast, but there's some places that they hadn't been into to chart out or map out where the edge of the land was. So they headed up into there, and maybe they headed up into there, but they hadn't been in this area to explore it, to map it out. And some of these names I think are wonderful. Cape Farewell. And it took them 4 months to cross the Atlantic when they originally sailed in 1668. So you think they get to Cape Farewell, probably the last place that they're going to be seeing land for a while. Desolation, and then they get to the Island of Good Fortune, which I've always thought that maybe this is the point where they're saying we're seeing land for the first time in a very long time. And then you can kind of use your imagination, but you can see here is northern Quebec. So they would have been sailing north of northern Quebec and sailing into what we now know as Hudson's Bay, the James Bay area. Now, this is one of the parts of the map that I don't think they got quite accurate, because this doesn't really look like Hudson's Bay or James Bay to me, but they did refer to it as the bay where Hudson did winter. So they knew that that was where Henry Hudson had gone and where Henry Hudson's ship, where Henry Hudson had been lost in the bay. And when the original Nonsuch sailed back in 1668, she was looking for a trade item that was quite popular in Europe, that they'd kind of hunted out in Europe. They were looking for beaver fur. And so she would have sailed with a hold full of trade goods. And when they sailed into the bay, they were sailing, looking to make contact with some of the First Nations communities that lived along the bay. And they did encounter, they ran into, and they traded with a group called the Amushkegu. And one of the other things that we've added here is the oral history, is the story of the Nonsuch landing from the First Nations perspective. What it was like when the First Nations communities living along the coast saw this ship sailing into the bay. And here we have Louis Bird, who's actually telling us the story. We have it in English and French and in Cree, of what it was like when they saw this and they thought, maybe that's an island. You can see there's a tree sticking out of it. And maybe those are clouds. But then they realized it's moving. It must be a boat. And one of the stories that Louis Bird tells is that the boat actually landed on a sandbar and got stuck on a sandbar. And the First Nations in the area, they were saying, what do you think we should do? Should we go out and help them off the sandbar? And they did. And they traded. And he talks about how the first trade that they did was, if I'm remembering correctly, was for an axe head. And we're going to trade you an axe head for some of those beaver furs that you have. So this is one of the things that we have added. It's bringing in that different perspective, that it's not just about the Nonsuch sailing across the ocean. It's about First Nations communities that had lived here for thousands of years before that were an integral part of the fur trade. Here we have the Nonsuch. This is our full-sized replica. The original Nonsuch sailed across the Atlantic in 1668, spent the winter there, sailed back to Europe, sailed back to England in 1669. So she sailed over with a hold full of trade goods. She sailed over with a crew of about a dozen men. Of course, there would have been no women on the ships back in that day. But with a dozen men, 4 months to cross the Atlantic Ocean, sailing over with a hold full of trade goods. Spent the winter over there trading, sailed back in 1669 with a hold full of furs. And out of that first voyage, the Hudson's Bay Company was formed. Because before that, all of the fur trade had gone in through the St. Lawrence. But there were a couple of Frenchmen that realized we might be able to sail in to Hudson's Bay. Might be a bit more of a direct route rather than going in overland through the St. Lawrence, across what we now know as Ontario, across what we now know as Manitoba and Quebec. So they sailed into Hudson's Bay, traded with the First Nations communities. And the Hudson's Bay Company, formerly known, the exact title is the Governor and Company of Adventurers Trading into Hudson's Bay. It was formed in 1670. So 300 years later, fairly important anniversary, the Hudson's Bay Company said, let's do something really important to mark that anniversary. And they decided to build a full-sized copy of the Nonsuch. And the kind of cool thing that they did with that is that they said, we want this to be as authentic as possible, so we're only going to use the tools that would have been available at the time that the ship was originally built. Cost them a bit more, took them a bit longer than it might have if they were using the tools that had been available in the 1960s, but they said, we want the ship to be as authentic as possible. We'll show you a few of those tools in just a couple of minutes, but for now, I think it's time to head on board the Nonsuch. Welcome. Let's step back in time. Now the Nonsuch, she would have been sailing only with sails, no motors back in the 1600s, although when this copy did sail in the 1970s, she had an engine on board. They had to get to some places at certain times, and so they figured, yeah, we should probably have an engine rather than just relying on the sails. And every once in a while, the ship might have to stop somewhere. And in order to stop and stay in the same place, the ship had 2 anchors. And Aaron, if I can get you to show one of the anchors, these anchors weighed like 500 pounds. And you're going to have to pull those anchors out of the water every once in a while. 500-pound anchors. Now I know there's a dozen guys on board the ship, but 4 of them are officers. They're probably not going to want to get their hands dirty doing that kind of work. And so they developed some technology. How do we pull up 500-pound anchors in a way that we can actually do it? And so this is called the windlass. And how they figured they would do it is they created a pulley, a kind of system that we're going to put this in here, one on each side. And the guys working on the ship, they would push this down. It would pull the anchor up. And every time the anchor was raised a little bit, it would get locked in place over here. So we're going to push this thing. It's going to pull the anchor up 2 or 3 inches at a time. And then this is going to lock it in place so that it doesn't go back down again. And then when we're getting ready to lower the anchor again, these are not in place. And we're just going to flip that up and the anchor is going to roll down. So that is how they were able, that's how they could raise and lower the anchors. And if you look on the ship, there's, I believe, 4 kilometers of rope on board the ship. Everything from really thin ropes to be holding the sails up to the really thick ropes to be holding the anchors in place. Some of them are covered with tar. Those are known as the fixed rigging. They're a bit more waterproof, being covered with tar, but they're not quite as flexible. So those would be the ones that would be in place for most of the time. And the ropes that look like, well, rope color, not covered in tar. If they get wet, it's probably not as good for them, but those are the ropes that you want to be lowering and raising some of the sails. You're going to get water on board the ship. It's in the water. But getting water down in the hold is not a really good idea. So you can see that the floor is not flat. The floor is curved, kind of like a saddle, so that you can be pushing the water out the sides. And a couple of guys would be on board mopping. And the water would go out holes in the side called scuppers. There's actually a technical word for the holes in the side of the ship, scuppers, that they would be mopping the water out. And every once in a while, there would be water that would get down into the main part of the ship. So in order to take care of that, they had a bilge pump. And this, you can see, goes all the way down to the bottom of the ship. And they could pump this, and the water would come out, and the water would come out here, and they would mop the deck and sweep the water off the side of the ship. Let's quickly head up to the top and see how the boat would have been getting directions. And, this is back in the day. The Nonsuch is old enough that it's back in the day before they had steering wheel technology. So we've got our tiller and our rudder that they would have been using to be steering the ship. And you're going to pull this depending on which way you want to go. And you can pull this, it's attached to the rudder, and that's how they would steer the ship. And once every, they would check the direction of the ship with the compass. So that would be one of the jobs that one of the folks would have on board the ship would be, let's see, are we going north, south, east, or west? And they'd be able to map that out. The captain, the officers would be able to pull out a map and be able to map out the direction that they were going on board the ship. Let's have a quick look down in the captain's quarters, then we'll continue on. So this would be where the officers would be staying. There's some bunks and a place to sit down. Pull out. Yeah. One of my favorite things on board, this is a speedometer. This is what they would use to figure out how fast the boat was going. And you'd get a couple of sailors that would head out to the back of the ship, toss this out the back, and it would unroll when it went into the water. And they would actually count the number of knots to figure out how many knots per hour the ship was going. And so this would be the speedometer. And once you calculate the speed and you calculate the direction that the ship is going, you can have a pretty good idea looking at your map of where you are and where you've been. Right. So let's go and have one last thing before we head off the boat. There are a couple of dogs on board the ship. And they're called Boots and Wellington. And the story that I got about Boots and Wellington is that when they were building the replica, there were a couple of dogs that hung out on the site with them. And they decided that as a token of appreciation for the dogs hanging out with them on the site, they would carve replicas of the dogs on the ship. We're gonna go have a quick look, because this ship actually sailed on the water for a couple of seasons. So let's go have a quick look at where the ship actually sailed. And in terms of new things here in this gallery, when you're able to get back here, the lights and the sounds are all new. So the lights will be changing from morning to noon to night. You might hear a pub kicking in the background. You might hear a rooster crowing at dawn. And we actually have some of the tools that they used to build the ship. And we have a map of where the replica, of where that boat actually sailed on the water. She was built in England. They brought her over on a much larger ship, landed in Montreal. She sailed around the Great Lakes. Then they put her on a truck and drove her from Superior all the way up to Seattle. And this ship actually sailed around Vancouver Island for a season before they brought her here. And I'm told by the conservation team that she probably could be seaworthy again, but she's not going anywhere. So we're gonna go have a quick look at one of the other new parts of the museum in our Boreal Forest Gallery. And when the Nonsuch sailed, she was looking for beaver fur. I mean, many other furs with the fur trade as well. And we tend to, I know when I think of beavers, I think of, just the rodents that are sitting beside a tree. But beavers, this is a new area. And beavers are amazing animals. And this really shows, and what we wanted to show here, beavers are actually really dynamic animals. And their back feet are flippers so that they can swim. They've got that amazing tail, which is good for helping them swim, which also warns other animals if there are people or predators in the area. I know when I was out on the Seine in a canoe yesterday, or pardon me, over the summer, we were paddling and there were a couple of beavers swimming beside us and they splashed their tail in the water and dove off. And you can definitely see how that would be a good warning for other animals. Get out of the way, there's some predators in the area. This also shows, the beavers, they build their homes out of wood. And they build their beaver dams and their beaver lodges. And they're quite well adapted. Their eyes have got extra sets of lenses so they can see underwater. They've got 2 sets of lips so that they can have their mouth open underwater carrying a stick and they're not swallowing water. And one of my buddies that works at the museum actually found a piece of wood that you can touch that shows where a beaver would have been chewing. I mean, beavers eat trees and they also use them for their homes. And we sometimes, beavers have teeth that do keep growing. They're rodents, they need to keep chewing. And every once in a while, their teeth aren't quite properly aligned. And they keep growing. So this is an example, and this is a beaver that was trapped. It was still alive, but one of its teeth had kept growing and growing and growing. And the teeth would have been a little bit misaligned and they only would have been able to chew on the one side. Like I say, that beaver was still alive, but I can't imagine that that would have been good for its long-term survival prospect, shall we say. So let's head over. We have 2 galleries that I really want to show off to you. We're about 20 after right now. So let's head over. Let's head into the prairies, Aaron. Let's go check out our original Prairies Gallery went back about 30 years or so. And the museum decided, you know, it's time to, how we understand the past and what we know has changed a great deal since then. We added in this rock, a bison rubbing stone. When you get to the entrance to the Prairies Gallery, the gallery only opened in April. So it still sort of has that brand new gallery look and feel to it. And here you have what Winnipeg might have looked back, if we could step back into our time machine back to 1470. And here is this amazing painting by a local First Nations artist, D. Barzy, depicting some of the animals, some of the scenes that you might be seeing on the prairies in this wonderful, vibrant blue. Seeing people, I'm seeing bison, I'm seeing some salamanders or lizards, I'm seeing some cool looking spiders. You've got something that looks like a butterfly or a moth or something brightly colored with wings. And then we're taking all of those ideas and bringing them to life in the prairies. Starting with, how do plants survive? I mean, it's pretty darn cold out there. We had a pretty darn dry summer, but the plants here are amazing. They're able to survive. Here we have our big blue stem. They can have roots that go down 10 feet, 3 meters. So even if they didn't get any water, for example, this past summer when it was so dry, the roots can just go down farther and farther to be finding water. And if it gets really cold, the way that it's gotten cold for the last little while, the roots can survive. The roots won't freeze because they go that deep down into the ground. Some of the plants and some of the animals that live on the prairies have amazing adaptations for surviving here. And there have been people that have been living on the prairies for thousands of years. I mean, the Europeans arrived a few hundred years ago. But we'll be having a look at some of the examples of some of the people and how they survived. One thing I think is kind of cool, we think of all the animals that survive on the prairies, and they go from really, really big, like bison big with really big jaws, to really small. And I think this exhibit is really cool because it shows here are some of the different jaw bones of some of the different animals, ranging from the bison and all the way down to the vole. And then from the black bear to the shrew. So just some of the different animals, and all sort of similar, the ones that eat the herbivores and the carnivores, but put in the context of what the prairies would have looked like before the plow. You still have the rivers, where some of the first settlements were. The Red River settlement, of course, right around the forks, Upper Fort Garry. And we brought some elements of kind of the dynamic thing of like, what would it be like if you're out there and if you could see a coyote hunting? And so we have our coyote, given that we've got our coyote that is hunting a jackrabbit. And right now it's looking like the jackrabbit's probably going to be getting away. Or is the coyote hunting? Yeah, I think the coyote's going after the grouse. And we've got, so it really gives you that sense of, you know, not animals just sitting there behind glass, but this is what it would look like to be in the midst of one of the coyotes hunting the grouse. Got a bit of a winter scene there. And when you're next able to come to the museum, make sure that you look straight ahead, but also make sure that you look down, because there's a life underneath the ground. And this shows how different animals have adapted. Our ground squirrel burrowing under the ground. We've got some frogs. We've got some toads. Some toads that live under the ground, some salamanders. Good protection from animals that live up top. Good place to stay cool in the hot weather, to stay warm when it gets cold, if you can hibernate underground. We've got our animals like our badger. And we've got some of the squirrels that are making noise, warning other animals, look out, there's a badger in the area. You can see how well badgers are adapted for hanging out underground. So we've got the hunt going on here. Manitoba also has a lot of wetlands, and here we have just some of the birds that call Manitoba home, or that have called Manitoba home. A wide variety with their different adaptations. They've got nice long beaks. Some of them have got shorter beaks for cracking seeds. Some of them have got longer beaks for hunting in the water. Just a wonderful variety of wildlife. And I say look underneath the ground, but you've also got to look up. And we have our turkey vultures. Turkey vultures have a rather creative way of defending themselves. If they're being attacked by other predators, they will projectile vomit on the other predators to try and keep them away. I think that's a fairly good form of defense against other animals. And we also have information about the people that have lived here. And also about, like, how do we know all this stuff? Because there's a whole lot of information at the museum. And where do we get this information? How do we know what we know? Well, here we have a recreation of, if you were to dig down 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 feet into the ground, what would it look like? Starting at the top at the old Brockington House area. And if you look at the top, there's things like glass bottles. So evidence of the people that lived here more recently had glass bottles. And you can see the layer upon layer upon layer. And here in Manitoba, with flooding as we've had, and you're able to get some really clear layers. And then we get to this layer, quite an intense layer of bison bones. And so this is an area where there had been a bison hunt by the First Nations people. And fairly consistent over a while to have that many bones as a layer. And the First Nations had some really interesting ways of hunting bison. And for example, as Aaron is showing, they could get them all running in the same direction into a circular area. Now, bison don't have great depth perception. And their eyes are on the side of their head so that they can see predators that are coming at them from many different sides. And so when they get into that kind of a circle, they'll go into the circle, and lo and behold, there are hunters waiting for them. So they might start running in circles, and they might even be running into each other, but it's a really effective way to be hunting mini bison at the same time. And here we have the historical evidence of this layer of bones. And you can see a couple of the places that they would have been, that we would have been finding evidence of this that Aaron's showing on the map. We have different examples of some of the tools that they would have been making. We've got, for example, a spoon made out of a bison horn. And they could use things like sinew to be using as thread. And of course, the bison hide to be using as coats, or say as teepees that we'll be looking at in a minute. And if you want to get a close look, we actually have a bison jaw that we can get a closer look at. It's got the nice flat teeth. Bison are herbivores, so they need those nice flat teeth to be grinding down their food. So for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived, the First Nations people had a rich life here. And they had a good life. They knew how to be hunting. They knew how to be building homes. They could keep them warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And they could get everything that they needed.
Nancy, this one's actually from Brockington, I believe.
Okay, yeah. So this bison bone is actually from this site that we're looking at, from Brockington. There's many artifacts that have been gathered. So I mean, that's how archaeologists are able to do their work. They're able to dig down and find evidence of what life was like and how people were able to make what they needed out of what they could find in their environment. And then, well, let's quickly head into the teepee. So teepees are wonderful. The word teepee itself is the Dakota word for home. And we have a teepee here that was made for us. This one's out of cloth, although they normally would have been made out of bison hides. Let's have a quick look inside. To be making these warm in the winter time, you could add an extra layer and put in some extra fur to keep it nice and warm. We're actually sitting on bison hides. Very, very thick fur, good at keeping the animals warm. And when made into coats, very good at keeping the people warm. And you'd have the fire in the middle. And if you look up top, you can be opening up the top to be either letting the smoke out, or if it's the summer and you want to get a bit of a breeze, you can have that open to be getting some air flowing through. And you can also pick them up and move them depending on the time of year. Say, for example, in the springtime, when there might be flooding at the forks, wouldn't want to be hanging out at the forks in the springtime, so they could pick up the teepees and move at that point. And it wasn't just hunting that they did. The First Nations also were quite good at agriculture and at creating tools for farming. You may have heard of the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash that complement each other, and growing in slightly different ways, adding different nutrients to the soil. And to be farming, we could take a bison scapula and take some hide, make it into a rope, attach it to a stick, and lo and behold, here we have our bison scapula hoe that we could use for farming. And, so again, I mean, so often we think of technology, we think of things like the Zoom feed that we're on, but this is a form of technology that made farming more efficient and allowed the development of First Nations agriculture. And you can see examples of some of the scapula hoes that have been found along the riverbanks. And the one that I was holding is something we called experimental archaeology, where we're actually creating tools saying, would this work? Yeah, it turns out that this would work. This is a good way to be farming. Some of the food, some of the seeds, some of the beans, corn, which would have been brought up from Mexico. Very, very valuable crop. I mean, now we have popcorn, but there's many different ways of using corn, maize in food. Now, when we talk about the fur trade, one of the things that's important to remember is that the modern day fur trade, or what we know as the fur trade, was built on thousands of years of indigenous trading across North America. We've got a couple of maps here and some artifacts that actually show evidence of those trade routes. Here at the Forks in Winnipeg, we found objects from as far away as the Atlantic Ocean, and Vancouver Island, the Gulf of Mexico, from Lake Superior, from across the United States. So when the Europeans arrived, they were building on trade routes that First Nations had been trading on for thousands and thousands of years before that. And one of the interesting things here, we even have some copper artifacts. You know, So often we tend to think of copper as, of metal as arriving with the Europeans, but First Nations were mining and making tools out of copper thousands of years ago. And that stuff would have come from an area around Thunder Bay, where they could mine it and make tools. If you've been here before, you'd probably recognize this house. And there's a couple of things that we kept from the original. It's an example of a Red River house. And one of the things that I like to point out is that we have a cat in the museum. There's a cat in the Red River house. The story that I heard about this is that somebody that worked at the museum for a long time, when their cat passed away, they thought that the cat should stay here. And so the cat was preserved and is now part of our museum collection. One of the ways for getting around on the prairies before we had cars was Red River carts. And they would have been carried by oxen. And they're all made out of wood. And with there being, say, things like not the ability to be lubricating any of the joints, they would have been quite noisy, quite loud. You could hear them coming from quite a distance, but a very effective way to be carrying bison hides, or if you were coming back from the hunt, or if you were going even from Winnipeg out to Portage, if you were going up throughout Winnipeg and throughout southern Manitoba, a very effective way to be transporting large quantities of goods. So we're at the point where there's getting to be more settlers on the prairies. One kind of interesting thing, women in Manitoba got the vote before, they were the first women in Canada to get the vote. And one of the things that we have is the side of an old farmhouse where the woman supported suffrage. So she wrote "Votes for Women" on the side of the house. Now, her husband wasn't quite so keen on the idea. So after he got home and realized what his wife had done, he wrote "No" on top of that in big letters. So not everybody agreed with women getting the vote. I'm not quite sure how that relationship turned out. I sometimes wonder. But we do have a replica of a petition for women for the vote. And if you look really closely, both men and women have signed it. So while there were some men that didn't support of their wives' ambitions, there were many men that were also supportive of women's right to be getting the vote. Let's see. I think it's almost time to head over into the Winnipeg Gallery. So we had a Prairies Gallery before, but it's been drastically renovated. We're heading into a brand new gallery. We are heading into our Winnipeg Gallery. This gallery did not exist until a few years ago. It's telling the history of the city of Winnipeg. Looking at everything from Winnipeg as an Indigenous homeland, becoming a city, city of newcomers, city of contrast, the military in Winnipeg, city of water, of course, because water has shaped much of the city, and city of celebration. And we're looking at some of, we've got, if anybody was at the original folk festival, we have an original folk festival program. Some items from Jets 1.0 and from the Winnipeg Jets 2.0, curling, Festival de Voyageurs, a jingle dress from the First Nations community. One of the really cool things in here that I want to talk about is when we look at Indigenous history and how we know what we know. And we've been hearing, there were stories of a peace treaty signed between a number of First Nations groups back 700 or 800 years ago. And during an archaeological excavation at the Forks, archaeologists found evidence of different kinds of pottery. Was it 9 or 7 different groups? Nine different groups, all in the same location dated from the same time. And so this suggests that yes, there was a peace treaty signed in about 1285 between 9 different First Nations groups that all gathered at the forks at the same time. Now, I mean, if you can imagine how difficult it is to get 9 of your friends together at the same time with the technology that we have, and to think that that kind of a large gathering to be discussing and to be making a treaty. So the treaties aren't just a new thing. The treaties go back hundreds, if not thousands of years of looking at how do we share the land, how do we work together on the land. And one of the other things that, now I'm going to jump ahead a few hundred years because Winnipeg is a city of a lot of newcomers. And some of your families might have even come over within the last 100 years, might have come over after World War I, might have come over after World War II, whenever they came over. I think of what it would have been like for the families to be saying, we're leaving where we've been living for all of this time, going off to a new land. And what we have here, we have some actual passports of people that immigrated to Canada. Over here, we have a woman that came from Czechoslovakia in 1936. And when we think of what happened in Europe and Czechoslovakia just a few years later, I sometimes wonder if this is somebody who had a family that could see the writing on the wall and decided this is a good time to be leaving and heading over to Canada. And there's a passport of a woman that left Germany in 1951, although the name is Hungarian. So I keep thinking there's a story there. It's a name that sounds Hungarian to me, but she left Germany in 51. And, so these are some of the stories of some of the people that decided to call Winnipeg home. And it wasn't just the parents that left, it was also the kids that were coming with them. And one of the things that I love to show here is we actually have toys from kids that came with their families. So there's a wind-up beetle that a boy who moved from Russia with his family brought over with him. And you think, you're explaining to your child, we're moving to a new country, what can you fit in the suitcase? And that's all that you can take with you. And there's a child somewhere that's thinking, I want to take a chemistry set, or I want to take a wind-up beetle. I look at that chemistry set and I think you probably couldn't get most of those chemicals these days, but that's a chemistry set from back in the 1930s. We've got our wind-up beetle. We've got a doll, and we've got a sticker book. I mean, how many of you have kids or grandkids that might be collecting stickers? We tend to think of those as a relatively recent thing, but that's from the late 1800s that a Danish girl brought over a book of stickers and kept that for all of that time, to the point that somebody said, let's share this. And they brought it to the museum and shared it with the museum. And just want to check, we're at about 1:45. So we're here for about what, another 10 minutes maybe?
We can go as long as you'll let us.
Okay, and we can go as long as you let us. We're going to be going at not quite to 11, and but we're going to be going definitely for another few minutes. If anybody remembers the old Eaton's building, it hasn't been gone for that long. At I'm pointing at this wall. At the entrance to the old Winnipeg building, the Portage Avenue entrance is actually this Tyndall stone that we have up top there. So, I mean, when we think of history, some of it is fairly recent. The Eaton's building wasn't demolished that long ago. And after the Nonsuch, this would be one of the larger objects that we have on display. If anybody remembers reading the old Winnipeg Tribune, maybe delivering the old Winnipeg Tribune,
yep.
We have one of the newspaper boys that used to adorn the old Winnipeg Tribune building. And the charming boy looked down at pedestrians from the Winnipeg Tribune building. That building was demolished back in '83, but we still have that as something that we can remember back to the days of the old Winnipeg Tribune. So let's head on. So these are some of the highlights of our Winnipeg gallery. And let's head on to our final gallery. Let's dive back in town to 1920 And we've seen the old with the Nonsuch. We've seen the new with the Boreal Gallery, with the Prairies Gallery, with some of the objects here in our Winnipeg Gallery. And now we're heading on to and finishing up with Winnipeg back in 1920. At Winnipeg, Commerce, Prudence, and Industry. That was on the old City Hall. That was on a stained glass window from the old City Hall, if anybody remembers the old City Hall. Now, of course, we have the more modernist looking one. But back then we had the one that was sometimes called the gingerbread house for how it looked. And this was the stained glass window that adorned that old City Hall. But if we were to head back to Winnipeg in 1920, we could have our old Bank of Montreal building. We could have our old rooming houses. Oh wait, maybe we won't be heading up into the rooming house. We have our old pharmacy with some of the old cameras. I mean, now cameras are nice and digital and fit on phones in our back pocket. But back then, some of these gorgeous old box cameras. Stepping back in time, where you actually had to take in the films and wait for a couple of weeks to see how much fun you had on your holidays. There would have been female pharmacists back in Winnipeg 100 years ago. We have some of our old, well, he's standing beside an old phone and beside our post office. And of course, back in 1920, not that many people would have had phones in their homes. And you could come here to drop off a letter, to pick up some mail. And there's some old medication. And back in the day, we didn't just have drugs for people at pharmacies. We also had medication for animals. So we have our hog on it, in case you happen to be raising hogs. And medication for horses. Yeah, things have changed a little bit. We don't have hogs here in town. But back then, you could get medicine for your hogs and for your horses, as well as for the folks in your house at the pharmacy. Our next stop, we're going to be stopping. We're actually going to be taking a step back in time to where the museum would have been 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the Manitoba Museum was not here. And the Strathcona Hotel was here. And at that Strathcona Hotel, there was a restaurant. And so I always like to think of this as being a bit of a wink at the history, that the Strathcona restaurant would have been here 100 years ago. And if we were getting to be hungry, if we're getting close to lunch, we could get a waffle for 25 cents. We could get a waffle with bacon for 30 cents or a waffle with 2 eggs for 35 cents. Of course, wages were a little bit lower back then as well. And we could get a sandwich for a dime. We could get a ham or cheese or beef or tomato or relish or egg and olive or peanut butter. Or if anybody wants a sardine or veal or a tongue sandwich for 10 cents. And a slice of pie for a nickel. Or maybe you're going to come in here because you need to be making a phone call. And as the operator would pick up and say, "Hello, this is the operator. How may I direct your call?" Back in the days before we could put our phones in our back pockets. And, we could head out to a movie if we wanted. And, as we head from the north end over into the south end, we could be getting on our horse and buggy, leaving our horse at the entrance. He'd be drinking out of one of these old water, like water fountains that our horse could be drinking here. And maybe it's time to be seeing if Charlie Chaplin. Yep, Charlie Chaplin is playing at the movie theater. Winnipeg, 1920. The old classic silent films. Back in the days before the talkies were around. it's always kind of fun. I mean, you can tell exactly what's going on. They don't need the words to be figuring out what's going on and why it's funny. More of a physical comedy. Definitely more of a physical comedy. And maybe you've got somebody playing the piano on stage, providing some background noise. So let's keep going and we'll check in and see what Dr. Garvin is doing as we head down by the train tracks. We've got our lovely picture of the old City Hall, some signs from the strike, our old dentist office with Dr. Garvin, the good doctor and the lovely house he would have been living in the South End. Some of it looks kind of familiar, some of it looks a little bit different. Both with the dentist and with the house. Laughing gas back in the day. And the diploma's written all in Latin. There's a lovely sign on the wall that says, "Prepare to meet thy God." And never quite sure why they would have that sounds rather ominous if you're sitting in a dentist chair. But and the young girl holding onto a teddy bear with Dr. Garvin. And then let's wind up at the Bison. We started at the Nonsuch. And our last stop would be, if you were just coming to the museum, the first thing that you see when you get into the museum is, of course, the scene of the bison hunt, Winnipeg, and back 150 or so years ago. And we've got our friend Pierre, who is hunting the bison. And the First Nations would have been using bows and arrows and spears. And Pierre has his musket that he's hunting the bison with. And although he's also still wearing the clothes, the coat and the boots made out of bison hide. And it's quite a dramatic way to be landing at the museum and it's almost as if you can feel what it would have been like with the bison running across the prairies. When I was here back in the fall, I ran into a 4-year-old who was standing in front of the bison, and she said, "This looks really kind of scary." And I never really thought of it that way. I just thought it looked rather dramatic. But then I got down to the height of the 4-year-old and seeing the bison coming at you like this, yeah, I could see that would be a little bit scary. Quite a bit of a different perspective on it. And I reassured her that while the animals in the museum are real, they're not alive. The live bison, if you want to go see live bison, you can head out to the zoo, or you can go and head down to Fort White. And these are definitely real, but definitely not alive. And, but it really gives you, here at the Bison, there at the Nonsuch, going through the Winnipeg Gallery, going through the Prairies Gallery, and the Urban Gallery, of what life might have been like thousands of years ago for the First Nations, or hundreds of years ago, or up to 100 years or so ago, and even more recently than that, for the people that have chosen to call Winnipeg and Manitoba home. So that has been our tour of, we haven't had time to see everything at the museum. It's a really big museum. And so we've had a chance to touch on a few of our galleries, some of the old favorites, and some of the new stuff that we've added or updated over the last 5 years or so. So thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll have a chance to, if you have a chance to be coming here when the museum reopens. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Any last comments or questions?
Yeah, I'm going to unspotlight you for a second and see if we have any questions from everybody. It's hard for me to see everyone all of a sudden. So if anybody has any questions, you have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry, I just can't see everybody all of a sudden. Trying to unspotlight.
Well, first of all, I have to say that was a wonderful presentation. It was very engaging, and you really are pretty good at what you do, young lady.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Erin's just showing you one of the new things that we have here, as well as a bit of an introduction that when you get to the museum, you see a few artifacts from each of our galleries. We sometimes have people that have been here for a couple of hours and say, we had no idea that this was so big. So this highlights that we have Earth history and Arctic and Boreal and the Nonsuch Gallery and the Hudson's Bay collection and our parklands, which we, and prairies and our Winnipeg Gallery. So this just sort of gives folks, even as they're arriving at the museum, a taste of what they're going to see. There's Erin highlighting our recreation of the old Winnipeg City Hall. We've seen the pictures of it, and there's the 3D model of it.
Loretta, you got your hand up?
I was just going to go back to the Nonsuch, getting it inside the museum. Did they actually build that around the boat then? Or did
they did. That's a great question. So for bringing the Nonsuch here, they basically just built the floor and then brought the Nonsuch in. They had a really big crane that they lifted the Nonsuch off of the truck and put it on the floor of the museum and built the gallery around it. It is a little bit big to bring in the front door, and that would have been a whole lot of work if they had to take it apart piece by piece to be bringing it in. So that's where the Nonsuch is right now. I think this is a bit of a better use than a parking lot to be putting the Nonsuch in. Great question.
I had a chance to look up some information. I would strongly encourage everyone to go to the Manitoba Museum site. It is quite fascinating, all the different programs and exhibits they have going on. Also, you can also participate because they have a great membership program and they have tons of volunteers. So that's another opportunity for people to get firsthand knowledge. But it was an excellent presentation. Erin, I didn't forget you either, Erin. I know you're walking around with the camera and the video, so excellent job to you as well.
Yes, Erin, excellent. Yes. Excellent job, Erin. And our camera operator is getting a nice call out.
All right.